Hi there, I'm Z, and today we're going to discuss the lands that you can play in the Pauper format. It's a majority of the lands. I did skip a few because they're extremely bad, but let's get at it. So yeah, lands end up playing a huge part in Pauper, and there's quite a lot of non-basic lands. I think there's 176 different non-basic lands that you can play, so let's get together and have a little discussion of all of them, okay? Wonderful, love it. The Ossity Sack lands. These suck. Don't play these. These are terrible. They have no use. I don't know why you'd play these for a splash. These are tap lands that have very little upside. You shouldn't play these. Never even knew these existed until this point. So, yeah, they're bad. And no one plays them. The Deserts. A relatively new addition from Thunder Junctions. These enter the battlefield and deal 1 damage to your opponent. They're used for triggering crime in draft. And there is like one relevant crime card, the Raven, that deals 1 and you lose 1. These are fine. They're relevant for like 2-color aggro decks. A few damage here and there can actually really add up over the course of the game, but your deck has to care about that 1 damage over the other huge number of positive effects that exist in Pauper in the land base. These are niche playable and are good when they're good and mediocre every other time. The snow type lands. So there are unsnow type lands. I'm going to discuss type lands more when I get to just the normal type lands. But snow type lands, you just have to care about the snow status. Typically it's for the card Scred, which cares about the number of snow lands you control. Otherwise, you should just play the non-snow ones, unless you really, really love the art on the snow ones, and they are typically kind of better. There's cards like Thermocast, and there's a black equivalent of Thermocast, whose name I forget, that make the opponent gain 1 life. Thermocast isn't even that popular in the format, but if we're playing at like the highest level of optimalness imaginable, then you should play the non-snow ones. But they're still great. Yeah, they're cool, and they do have a place in quite a few decks, because Scred is quite a popular card. So the Artifact lands. These are single-colored lands that have the Artifact land type. These cards, These cards are very, very powerful and are a massive staple in the format. They don't enter the battlefield tapped. Their downside is that they're quite vulnerable. There are lots of artifact destruction in the format, which means that you can take out these lands. But the upsides are effects like Affinity, which care about the number of artifacts you control. Decks like Kuldotha that sacrifice artifacts to make 1/1 tokens. This card is the glue that holds together several of the most powerful decks in the format. These cards are so powerful that you could discuss banning them. You should not, because they are the heart and soul of the format, but very, very, very powerful cards in the correct deck. If your deck doesn't care about artifacts, you should play basics instead of them. You do not want the slight downside of your lands being destroyable. So the Invasion Sack lands, these lands might have names. I don't know them. So yeah, this land pseudo-fix and can give you a burst of mana. These cards are fine. I remember these seeing quite a lot of play in the past. The fact that they enter the battlefield tapped is not great. And I think overall, you would play depletion lands over them. I could see these cards seeing play in the future, and I can imagine there are some decks that fringe play these for various reasons. But as it stands, Invasion Sack lands are a little bit secondary. A card to be aware of, a card that you can sacrifice for 2 mana, it is powerful, but it's not good enough yet. And there is no real shell that is super exploiting that. The Ash Barrens. So Ash Barrens is an exceedingly interesting card. It's an untapped land for 1 colorless, and you can basic land cycle it for 1. So this card used to be, I think, played a lot more. It's very useful for shuffling your library, and it's very useful for finding untapped white sources. So there is the Lord of the Rings Land Cycler cycle, which is 3 big creatures, draw 3, that let you find islands, swamps, forests, and mountains. Unfortunately, that cycle is incomplete and there is no plains version of it. You might say that it's the Eagles of the Great North or whatever the fuck that card is called, but that card is terrible and you shouldn't play it. So very occasionally there'll be 2-color mana bases that want to play white and they want to have an access to untapped white on turn 2. Now your Lorien Revealed, for example, doesn't find untapped white, it only finds tapped white. So in those situations, if you're playing like a Brainstorm deck and you're also playing white mana, this card comes up, so you might see 1 or 2 floating around. But overall, this card does see a lot less play than it used to, but it's a very interesting land fixer that has quite a lot of uses. The Bounce lands. I think that the Bounce lands are the best example of card advantage in the land slot. Grindy decks like Turbofog use this land a lot. You will find that I will say Turbofog uses this land because Turbofog mana bases are degenerate and full of one-ofs and weird cards. But a serious chance for like the bounce land see play afterwards. So what a bounce land is, it enters the battlefield, you return a land to your hand, and it taps for 2 mana, but it enters tapped. These cards used to be much more powerful in the past with cards like Cloud of Fairies. Now, unfortunately, there's not a great deal going for them to be like busted because those cards got banned, but they're still powerful. They still see fringe play as a little bit of card advantage in these sort of more grindy control decks. They're just less ubiquitous than they used to be because the format's a little bit faster, so your mana base has to be a little bit leaner, and the control decks are just not as popular, but still a great card. I think you'll usually see Dimir Aqueduct to be the one that sees play, but yeah, or Simic, I guess. Powerful effect. A card to think about if you're playing a controlling deck, but overall, not something to just jam in every deck. Guild Gates, like typical normal Guild Gates, which are just 2 mana lands that have the gate text. There's like a deck that plays 2 or 3 of these called Gates. Overall, these are not fantastic. There's a card that we'll talk about later that has, for the most part, replaced them. Interesting card, but in general, if you want to have a very basic 2-color mana base, you want to play Desert or Gain lands. But I'm going to say, typically in Pauper, your mana base actually is really important, and you're making like conscious decisions in your mana base. And gates are like the lack of a conscious decision, and so they end up being pretty bad. Panoramas, they've been outclassed in all ways. Don't think these are ever fucking good. Do not play panoramas. Don't waste my time. Terrible, terrible cards. 1 mana cyclers. These are pretty interesting. They cycle for 1 colored mana. I've just included the 1 mana cyclers over the 2 colorless cyclers and the desert cyclers. There's a same cycle that cycle for 2 colorless, and then there's a desert cycle that's a colorless and a colored mana. Those are bad. I don't think you play the 2 colorless ones even. I think that the 1 colored mana ones are the best. Maybe there's an argument for something like Tron, but these are the strongest. And again, these don't see a great deal of play. They're typical in 1 color mana bases, and in the past they used to be quite popular. Mono black and mono red used to play them. Overall, the upside is just not there. A tap land is a high cost, and 1 mana to draw a card is not a card that you'd want to put in your deck. So you basically never want to play it as a tap land, so you're just playing 1 red to draw a card, but you could just play something better than that. And so in general, they just don't see a great deal of play in these like aggressive decks like they used to, because you can't afford the tap land and then maintain your tempo. Maybe they'll see a resurgence. I know there's decks that care about the graveyard, like maybe you would play this with Mulch or fucking Seder Wayfinder for this little bit of extra value, but Barrymore is not 8 anymore, and neither are its friends. Lost Caves? Stuff like that. Basilisk Gate. The guy. A land so good he's got a deck named after him. I mean, it's called Gates, but he's the gate of the gates. This card is exceptionally powerful. An entire archetype uses gates, which are suboptimal lands, to synergize with this card. When you activate it, it'll be 3 or 4 or 5 plus. Yeah, so, I should describe the cards, I guess. So this card is, you can pay 2 and tap it to give a creature +X, where X is the number of gates you control. Amazing card. I think this card is actually arguably underplayed, and you could play more Gates mana bases in more like vague 2-color decks. Never sleep on the Gate. Basilisk Gate's fantastic. The deck Gates is quite strong and popular right now. This card is great. I mean, to an extent, would I pay 3 mana to give a creature +1/+1? There is a certain number of situations where that effect in itself is quite good. So yeah, Basilisk Gate fucks. Black Dragon Gate. This is another gate card, and I feel like I said the word gate a lot, but when it enters the battlefield, you choose a color other than the color of the gate. So Black Dragon Gate is black, and then you can be one of those 2 colors. So this card is actually much more flexible than the straight up like Azorius Guildgate, Simic Guildgate, just that there are 2 colors of lands, and it lets you have quite interesting deck building decisions. If you play 8 of these in your deck, then you have 8 off-color mana sources for sideboard cards if you need them. This means that decks like Core Gates could play quite a diverse sideboard plan or even a main deck plan. I could see possible 3-color quite slow mana bases that utilize these effects. These are quite good cards. The Thrivings are the same as this without the gate text. But yeah, these are the bases of a deck called Gates, but there's something to be conscious of in the future if you ever want to have like a cheeky mana base that doesn't need to be one of these other things. Now, I will talk about this later, I think, but that's rare. Like, the mana bases are important and good, but yeah, it's an interesting card that gets you sideboard splashes that you might want if you're playing like a pretty linear 2-color deck that might need it. The Gain lands. These are the opposite of the crime lands. These are fine. You gain 1 life. 1 life can matter, but again, they're just pretty generic. If you're playing some sort of slowing controlling deck, I guess you might play these occasionally, but they're nothing to write home about. They just exist. They're fine. They used to be better. The land bases have kind of gotten past Gain lands, but you'll see them come up, and the 1 life can sometimes represent something. Interesting cards, though. Definitely a land to maybe think about sometimes, not often. Bojuka Bog. So I'm going to first say I think Paducah Bog is somewhat overrated of a card, and I just say that because I think the card is exceedingly highly rated. It has a cost of being a tapped land. It's also not a swamp for cards like Snuff Out, which is important, and it exiles a graveyard when it enters the battlefield. So with cards like Crop Rotation, it's very powerful, but very few decks are playing Crop Rotation. It ends up being this like free roll effect in like black decks, and you could consider this card colorless and maybe like think about putting it in any deck. But it isn't really a replacement for hate. So a deck like Serpent, that's not called Serpent. Anyway, Mono Blue, that deck needs like accumulated massive cards, and bogging them ends up having quite a large impact on their game plan. And there are a few decks that use the graveyard for value, but quite often the graveyard is used as a combo tool. And this is just too slow to deal with that. So it isn't a replacement for real graveyard hate. But it is very, very powerful. You'll see lots of mana bases with it. I'm not saying this card is weak. I do think this card is very, very strong. It's just not a replacement for graveyard hate, and most people are aware of that. You might also see one of Intron to search up with an expedition map, but it's a powerful card that sees a lot of play. The Capenna draw lands, I think it's a cycle of 5. It's a tap land that makes one of 2 colors, I think allied, and you can sack it for 2 colored and 2 colorless to draw a card. So this is 5 mana draw card. This is just not good enough. This effect is not powerful enough. The format is fast enough to mean that 5 mana draw card is just never where you want to be. Control decks often want to get up to like quite a large number of lands in play anyway. We're not here. Botanical Plaza, its friends in the Capenna land draw cycle, which they might have a name, who knows. Not where we want to be. Not very powerful. The MH3 fetches. Now we're talking. These cards are very, very, very powerful. Some of the best fixing for 2 or 3 color decks. And if your deck has any amount of colorless mana symbols in it, like as in you're not playing cards like Counterspell, and I mean even in Counterspell decks you still play this card because it shuffles the library for Brainstorm. This card is exceptionally powerful. I think it's important to remember that you don't have to be all 3 colors, and that the cycling cost is basically flavor text. It is actually on the card to remind you the 3 colors of mana that this card makes. And I'm not saying that the cycle doesn't come up. I think Grixis is the only deck that this might be the case. But this is very, very powerful and some of the most powerful generic fixing in the format. And if you're building a deck, I think to often consider to put into your mana base. The Capenna fetches. So these are just worse than the MH3 fetches in a lot of ways. Yes, they gain 1 life, but you have no control over when you're sacking it. Maybe if you had like a Landfall Matters deck, you'd care, but I don't think that's the case because of the new MH3 fetches. These cards have just been outclassed with time. They're fine, but you just wouldn't really play them anymore. Interesting cards in the past though, but I don't even think they'll see a place in the future. Just not really where we want to be. And there's no tricks, by the way, when it like enters the battlefield, like sacking it or doing anything like that. These just enter the battlefield, then become a forest, a plains, or an island. If you're the Broker's Hideout, nothing going on there. Captivating Cave, so it's adds a colorless. You can tap it +1 to add any mana, or you can tap it +4 to put +2/+2 +1/+1 counters on a creature. This card's not very good. I just thought it was interesting to talk about. You could like loop this with Evil Witness. It's not a card that I knew existed, but unfortunately just the way that it is right now and the strength of Pauper, effects like this are too slow. You can't really be messing around in your mana base with these sorts of colorless effects very effectively, and we're just not in a place where any of this really matters. But it's still an interesting card that I doubt we'll ever see play, but it's fun that it exists. There's also another version of this card as well, but it's the same thing, but it's not a cave. Conduit Pylons. This also stands in for a card that does the same thing but isn't a desert, and the Crystal Grotto, which is Scry's one. I'm going to say this card is much slower than it seems. So it enters the battlefield and you surveil one. It's untapped, so you tap for colorless, and you can pay 1 and tap it to add 1 mana of any color. So the pay 1 to add 1 mana of any color is much slower than I think when people come into formats that effect seems. That's very, very slow. This card is good in decks like Tron that want to do fixing. It's also good in decks that are splashing. It's good in Dredge, where it wants to put the card into the graveyard. Combo decks usually use the Scry version, which is the same, but you don't want to be forced to surveil a 1/of that's a combo piece or draw it if you have some sort of like crazy mana base. These are specifically strong cards. These are not generically strong, but if a deck wants this effect and wants this type of card, these are very powerful versions of that. And to consider in general, if you're ever building kind of messy mana bases or want to produce quite a lot of colorless mana for effects, where the cost, the slow speed of it doesn't really hold it back, but then might later fix you into like a color that you need for a special effect. So the type land, so these have Island Swamp, forest, mountain, whatever. These are core to the format. I mentioned this with the snow versions of them, but typically because of slight downsides with snow, you would just play these. Since the Lord of the Rings land cyclers, which I mentioned previously, these just are the way that you would fix your mana base. A few of the land cyclers, plus some of these, you lose the upside of like gaining 1 life, or they take 1 damage, or whatever, but you gain like this consistency from the cyclers, which is why these see more play than the ETB effecty gainy losey lives. These are very, very powerful. They're the core of your mana bases. And if for some reason you aren't playing Lord of the Rings cyclers, which you might not be, this is when you don't play these types of lands. Unless you're drawn to play another type of dual land. But in that situation, that is when you would go to gain lands or sack lands or something else along those lines, where you don't need this style of fixing because you're not playing the land cyclers. Cradle of the Accursed, an untapped land that adds a colorless, and you can pay 3 and sack it to create a 2/2 zombie. Again, just a card that I thought would raise. I don't think mana bases can afford this in Pauper. You know, mana bases are typically quite color starved, and it's just a bit slow, but it's quite a powerful effect at a common, making a 2/2 out of your land base. Not saying that it's an effect that we're going to see right now, but it's just an interesting, cute little card to think about in the future. Maybe slot in at some point. I think it would make your deck probably worse, but still neat and just something I wanted to raise. Okay, Bridges. Another Ultra Storm staple of the format. So Bridges are artifact lands, like the artifact lands that we've previously seen, but they produce 2 colors of mana and are indestructible. So for Affinity Disc decks, which are the best Affinity deck right now is Grixis, which is 3 colors, but you often have other 2 color decks. This fixes their mana really effectively. There's a card called Cleansing Wildfire that is destroy target land. You fetch a basic, draw a card. Against a lot of decks will play this as their mana base. Will play these bridges so they can use this effect, because that effect is so unbelievably powerful that you will use bridge mana bases with Cleansing Wildfire, and that is the draw to doing it. I think this is a good time to mention, like, the mana bases in Pauper are very important. You're making a very conscious choice, which is why these like generic lands that gain you 1 or deal you 1 that you feel might be powerful end up not synergizing with the overall strategy. Like Affinity can't play these. You want to play Cleansing Wildfire in a bunch of these decks. Kenku, which makes a creature, a land, a 3/3, well, makes an artifact into a 3/3, which makes an indestructible 3/3 fly when you put it on a land. These cards are so synergistic and powerful, which means these generic lands don't see play because your land base is contributing so much to your power. It's why typically you see in the meta right now a bunch of 3-color, 2-color decks that are doing like stuff with their mana. Like Growl Ramp uses forests very heavily because it needs to for its Arbor Elves. You've got Dimir mana base. You've got not Dimir. You've got mana bases of Cleansing Wildfire. You've got mana bases of Affinity, and these all use their land bases. You then have the other end of the spectrum, which is monocolored land bases, and these try to prey on like the weaknesses and slowness of these more fancy land bases. So being monocolored gives you omega consistency. None of your lands enter the battlefield tapped until you start playing these like fancy lands, which is why you don't typically play these like fancy do stuff tapped lands, because the reason why you're playing monocolored is to prey on the slightly less consistent slower mana bases of the other decks. Terra, I remember the name of the deck. Terra is a good deck partly because it plays 16 islands and no other different types of lands, and it just crushes people with its consistency. But yeah, bridges are exceptionally powerful and are a key element of the Pauper format. Darksteel Citadel. So this card used to be a lot better. Unfortunately, the bridges came along. It does enter the battlefield untapped and is an indestructible artifact land, but it only produces colorless mana. Because the Affinity decks are 2 or 3 colors, they can't really afford to play this. If there was ever a monocolored Affinity deck, this card might see play, but that doesn't exist right now, so unfortunately, this card is unplayable. This is Actual Factual Desert, a card that used to see a lot of play in history, but it doesn't anymore. I have seen Turbofog put this card in their Lana base. It's fine. Unfortunately, it taps for a colorless, or it taps to do 1 damage after a creature has dealt its damage. This is a bit slow, but this is recursive removal in a deck like Turbofog that has a place. Overall, just not ideal anymore. Doesn't really have a home and just a little bit slow. A lot of creatures are also not 1/1s anymore. And like picking off the goblins from Kuldotha, for example, one at a time as they've hurt you, probably not where you want to be. Dwarven Mine. And this is a part of a cycle of cards. I'm going to talk about the other 3, with the exception of Mystic Sanctuary, because that card is too powerful. It is banned. So Dwarven Mine makes a 1/1 if you control 3 untapped mountains, and is a mountain itself. Oh, you usually call 3 mountains don't need to be untapped. Unfortunately, this is probably one of the weakest in the cycle. It's a tap land too often, and then in mono red, when it enters the battlefield untapped, its upside is not high enough. Just not good enough, and not something that we're really interested in. If there was ever some sort of mono red control deck that existed, this card might be pretty good there, but outside of that, it definitely doesn't exist. Not strong enough. Escape Tunnel. This was a card I was really interested in. I play Kiln Fiend quite a lot. It's one of my favorite decks. And I was really interested in, like, this card could make a Kiln Fiend unblockable, then you could go crazy on it. This card is bad. Right now, the MH3 lands replace it as something to sack and search for different colours of lands. There are no 5-colour mana bases, so the fact that it reaches for 5 colours instead of 3 is irrelevant. And Tribe wanted to play this card and Kiln Fiend wanted to play this card, were the main 2 decks I ever saw talk about it, but it's a tap land, and those decks just don't want tap lands. You can't really play it, so it's just not good enough. It seems really a lot more powerful than it actually is on the surface, but an interesting card regardless, and maybe it'll be playable at some point. I know Tribes lists do sometimes still play it, but they probably should just, in its place, play another Shadow card that draws a card that just seems much stronger than trying to get it out of your mana base. Gingerbread Cabin. And this is another one in that cycle that I mentioned before. If you control 3 forests, it enters untapped and you get a food. Better than making a 1/1, in fact. A food is more powerful. There are more synergies with sacrificing artifacts. But overall, just like gaining 3 life, even though it's slow. Again, I've seen this card be played a few times. It's not terrible. Green usually cares less about being linearly aggressive, unless you're playing the actual mono green deck where you wouldn't play it. But there are some like 2-color green decks that might consider a Gingerbread Cabin. Also, it's important to note these have the land type of forest and swamp and mountain, which means you can fetch it with your land cyclers, which is why these cards are even like remotely talkable about, because you can eventually get them in the late game to do something with them. They make your land cyclers better, although often you'd just be casting your land cyclers at that point. But it's a bit slow, maybe not great, but it's a card to consider sometimes, just not often. The Depletion Lands. These cards are degenerate and very, very powerful. They enter the battlefield with 2 counters on it, and when you tap them, you remove a counter, and you add 2 mana to your mana pool of the colour of the land. In a deck like Poison Stone, they can add counters back onto them. These just end up meaning that your deck plays a bunch of 2 mana lands in it to generate coloured mana, which is very, very powerful. But also, there are decks that are basically want to play 2 turns of the game. They want to have a setup turn, and then they want to have a combo turn. And in those decks, these are very, very powerful. We saw with the Invasion, these sack lands, like, they're trying to do a very similar thing, but are just less good than these in a lot of senses. Because, you usually just put 2 or 3 of these in play, and then you have no lands, but your opponent's dead. That's your goal. Invasion lands can play a similar role, but they kind of struggle in this setup turn, where they're just, like, a bit slower. But yeah, so these are very, very powerful, and you'll often see them be used in degenerate combo decks. So, cool. Glad they exist, I guess. Oh yeah, the Hidden Land cycle. They're a tap land that produces colourless, and then you can pay 6. So you can pay 5 plus tapping the land to discover 4. These are just too slow. For some reason, I thought these did it for 4 when I first saw them instead of 6. But they don't. They're very slow and shit. Don't play these. I thought these might seem French play. They won't ever. The Holdout Settlement. These make a colourless, and then you can tap an untap creature you control to make 1 mana of any colour. Again, this card is not played right now, but if there's ever some sort of like weird 3, 4, 5 colour creature deck that played a bunch of 1-drops and did something degenerate, hey man, this kind of rules. Are we going to see Inspired, a mechanic from Theros, be good because you can tap creatures and get mana? Who knows? Who knows? It's just an interesting card to think about for some weird, freaky stuff. Again, there's not a deck that exists that plays Holdout Settlement right now, but it's not a card that I would imagine would at no point in the future see no play. Like, it's powerful at the thing that it does, which is fix very efficiently. The Idyllic Range. This card is actually really powerful. It's played in exactly one deck, which is Mono White Weenie, the Mono White strategy, and it's very good in that deck. That deck does sometimes play Eagles of the North, which it shouldn't, but it does, and it can search this up late game, because I like how it's the thing that I think would be better than casting the Eagles of the North is to search a land that puts a +1/+1 counter on it. I guess that's probably not what you would do. But in general, that deck sees a few number of cards and making your 4th land drop into a +1/+1 counter. And the deck also doesn't hate a tap land. It doesn't enjoy a tap land, but it often doesn't get as punished as Mono Red would be, because it's not trying to play a 3 or 4 turn game. It's trying to play a 5 or 6 turn game, at which point as well as like having more interaction, which might at tap land is less of an issue. Colony Gardens, one of the most powerful lands in the format. It's a tap land that makes green, and it produces a 0/1 plant token when it enters the battlefield. This deck spawned a deck called Gardens, which is basically just a mono black deck that's increasingly sort of splashed in green cards, because an 0/1 is just very, very powerful. There are lots of effects in Pauper that you sacrifice a creature and draw 2 cards, and Colony Gardens lets you fuel that. Colony Gardens also lets you block and gain like 3 or 4 life, which is more than a food that you would get off the gingerbread cabin. Just a very, very powerful card. Doesn't see a lot of play outside of Gardens, but still, it's definitely a card that is a workhorse. And you know, the moment you get a deck named after you, you know you're strong. The campuses, these are tap lands. I assume that there's 3 of them. There's 5 of them, sorry, for each of the campuses. Tap lands of 2 colors, and you can pay 4 and tap it and scry 1. I have seen this in Turbo Fog mana bases. It's just too slow. Isn't strong enough. There's better fixing out there. It's a false friend. I think people sometimes think that these effects are good. If you're paying 5 to scry 1, you've just lost. Like, you just aren't winning the game anymore. So you don't need your mana base to do this sort of stuff. It's just not where we're at Pauper right now. Sujiri Step. Again, this card is not in any decks, but I just have to show some respect for Sujiri Steps. Protection from any color to target creature, and it taps for white, then has a tap land. Like, with the Void on the rise, this protection is less good than it's been in the past. And obviously it's sorcery speed protection, which means you can't protect it from creatures, which really means it's a card to push damage. And I think it's better than Escape Tunnel at that purpose. This card is just too strong for me to not think about sometimes. I think with Writhing Chrysalis it got dramatically worse, which is really unfortunate for it. But still a card that I think is good to be conscious that exists in the format. If you're ever looking for like an unblockable style effect or something along those lines. Just a really interesting card. Again, once you start putting cards like Crop Rot into your deck, cards like Sujiri Step become much more interesting, but what a cool guy. In the same family, we have Teetering Peaks. This card is also very good. Again, you don't see people play it, but this is like a desert that gives something +2/+0 and maybe makes an awkward trade, or it does something kind of weird. Teetering Peaks is undervalued. The main reason you don't Teetering Peaks doesn't see play, in my opinion, is because the mono-red mana bases rely on a very specific mana base that is quite high tempo, and it even kills off its own lands. So tap lands end up having a really high cost, and there is nowhere for this card to go. If there was ever a more mid-rangey style of mono-red deck that went slightly bigger, Teetering Peaks becomes more interesting. But yeah, it's just a card to think about. I think I'm overselling it. It's not like that good, but it exists still. There's like a whole load of them. It's like Halmar Depths and stuff like that. I didn't include those because I think if I show people Halmar Depths, they might play it, and they should never play Halmar Depths. It's a very bad card. And a lot of the rest of them are kind of irrelevant. +1/+1 on first strike. Flying's a thing in the blue one, but yeah, I think Teetering Peaks, Colony Garden, Bog, and Sujiri Step, which I believe is the first cycle, are the strongest. Spheres. So this is the best you're getting of sacking a land to draw a card, and I still think it's too bad. So I think the only few colours you'd play are blue or black, and you'd have to play some sort of blue blacky or black control deck. It's just not. Tap lands have a real cost, and once you're playing a 1 mana base, you're trying to abuse the fact that your mana is consistent. And so the moment you reintroduce inconsistency in your mana base to at some point later in the game pay 3 to draw a card, just isn't great. If I wanted this effect, I'd play cycle lands. Spheres are the closest though. 3 mana is a lot less. Their cost is a lot lower. They're close. I've not seen any lists play them, but spheres are close. So yeah. If mid-range decks existed, they might be better, but mid-range decks don't really exist. Pauper starts on turn 1 for the most part. And also, it starts on turn 1 in the way that you can play tap lands on turn 1. And that's a very conscious turn 1 play, to play like a bridge that's indestructible on turn 1. The Dross Pits, like if you're playing that on turn 1, like it's not as powerful of a play as playing a bridge, which I know sounds weird, but it isn't. The Tron lands, just as a little end thing, like Urza's Tron is a land, and okay, yeah, sure, you don't play them in any deck but Tron, but they're Pauper legal, they are very, very powerful, and while they don't have a place in the meta right now, I think Ponza scared a lot of them away. Tron goes hard, and is a deck that we should always respect and love because it's very interesting to play. There's lots of variants of Tron that are varying levels of interesting, but yeah, you would never. look, if you want to put like 3 random Tron lands into a deck, massive respect. But right now, you only play it in Tron, and it's fine when it's good. Yeah, just an interesting fact that it's Pauper legal and isn't really seeing much play. Even with Map and Summon's Crying. So yeah, that's everything I really wanted to say about lands in the format. There are some lands that I missed. I tried to just miss lands that are like... I did show some quite unplayable lands, but like realistically, you should never put into decks. There is a lot of interesting lands in Pauper, and increasingly we're seeing more and more and more. Again, I just want to sort of highlight the fact that I think Pauper decks are born out of their mana bases. Be it you're picking an Affinity mana base, you're picking a Lord of the Rings Cycler plus creature type, like land type mana base, you're picking a Gates mana base, a Tron mana base, you're picking a monocolored mana base. These are very conscious decisions you're making that informs quite heavily the sort of deck construction you're going to be. If you're not making one of these choices, I think to a large extent you're going to struggle. Even decks like Boggles, right? It's a very forest heavy mana base. You have quite a lot of forest heavy mana bases that use like specific types of fixing. So yeah, I think that building a Pauper deck, you do have to really think about what form of mana are you going to abuse? Are you going to use Kenku Artificer and, you know, try and get something out of your lands? If you're just playing a 2-color deck and you're just playing gain lands, then I think you've left some room on the table to brew and build a strong deck. And I think you need to be very, very conscious of what you're trying to get out of the mana base. What I'm even saying here is like, you build a 2-mana color deck and it is blue-green, and you're just like playing gain lands. It's your mana base for whatever reason. Put Gates and a Basilisk Gate into your fucking deck and it's got better. Like, unless you need super consistency, get rid of your mana base, put these Gates cards in. You want to be getting something out of your mana base, and that's what Pauper is right now. It is strong mana bases that are not fast. Like, quite a lot of them are slow, but they are giving you a ton of value over the course of the game and are vital for strategies. And again, if you're playing a deck where that isn't the case, like, and I mean this, like, the mono-color strategies are making that choice. You're picking mono-colored because you want to be more consistent, and so don't dilute that. Don't just start jamming these, like, one-of weird single-colored lands, like Teetering Peaks, as I've sort of even said. Like, no, get these out of your deck. You want mountains, you want islands, you want forests, you want swamps, or whatever. So yeah, thank you for joining me on my first attempt at this. It was a lot of fun, and I hope I do it again.